Poetry represents perhaps the most elegant use of language, the most delicate expression of the wide range of moods and feelings that make us most deeply human. For that reason, poetry can move us to think differently, behave differently, even sometimes believe differently.
That's where the poems do a lot of the work of moving from the general to the particular, how to make faith, how to adjust it to the person, how to apply it to the person. And that's why in this poem, for instance, there is already a belief in death having been defeated at the beginning of the poem, but that's not enough. Something more needs to be fought for, not something more needs to be achieved by the end of the poem.
We're speaking today with David Marno, Associate Professor of English at the University of California at Berkeley, about his beautiful book, Death Be Not Proud, The Art of Holy Attention. Marno takes as a subject a stirring sonnet of the English poet John Donne's and shows how Donne's poem works to focus our attention as it stirs our souls. I'm Matthew Wickman, founding director of the BYU Humanities Center and the host of this podcast. And now our conversation with David Marno. Welcome, David Marno. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I should say we're taping this the day before the presidential election. It's November 2nd right now, and it'll be released later. But I figure, presidential election in the air, let's talk poetry. So, David, thank you for joining us.
I'm so glad to be here, Matt, and thank you so much for the invitation. And in terms of poetry before the election day, I am teaching King Lear this week, starting tomorrow on election day. So imagine that conversation with my undergraduate students about an old man not wanting to let go of power.
Perfectly timed. Very good. I'm always excited by insights people have into the things literature can do, right? The ways it can help us think and feel differently, how it can help us realize new capacities in ourselves or engage the world in important ways. Your beautiful, I'll hold it up here for the camera, your beautiful 2016 book, Death Be Not Proud, does this regarding what you call the art of holy attention. And I'm looking forward to discussing this today. As a preliminary step, let's set up a couple of things. First, this is a 300-page book about a sonnet of 14 lines. So why a book to something, why something so massive to something so narrow, 14 lines, a sonnet?
You're saying it's an overkill, maybe?
No, it's actually extraordinary what you can do in this book with that sonnet. It's a beautiful book. I'm curious how you even thought to write an entire book about a single sonnet.
Well, speaking of overkill, this is a sonnet that claims to kill death. So there is a hyperbole that is at least one of the central figures. One of the central poetic rhetorical figures in the poem is hyperbole. So what better way of writing a book about it than writing a hyperbolical book? But honestly, this is a book that I didn't design it to be about a single poem. What happened was that I read this poem and other holy sonnets by John Donne that raised a whole set of questions for me. And as I concluded the book and started, looking for a publisher and showed it to people, the question that I kept getting about the book was, is this a single author book? Because there were so many larger questions that I addressed in the book that there was a concern about why one author. And eventually I just sort of doubled down and said, well, you have a problem with one author, then let's make it about one poem. and it was a hyperbolical gesture because this is a book that does not address that poem on every page. In fact, I think there are chapters where I don't talk about that particular sonnet. But I do stand by the claim that it is about one poem in the very specific sense that, number one, it's a book in which all the questions come out from my encounter with this poem. Really, it was an adventure, so to speak. I didn't have these categories that I'm thinking in the book beforehand, Thanksgiving or even attention. I never thought about those as concepts, and they all came out from the reading of the poem. So in that sense, it's about Death Be Not Proud, but also in the sense that I really remain sort of committed to considering the poem as my ultimate witness to all these ideas, in the sense that I kept returning to the poem throughout the entire book. And that's why the framework of the book is I start with Death Be Not Proud, and then I return to Death Be Not Proud in the last chapter as a kind of ultimate test of whether or not the things that I thought I found are there in the poem.
It's a brilliant experiment. It really is. I think it turned out really wonderfully, David. I wonder, since the poem is so short, it's a sonnet, it's 14 lines. Would you read that poem to us, John Donne's Death Be Not Proud from his Holy Sonnets, and then we'll talk about some parts of your book. Is that all right?
I would love to do that. This is a poem that one can, I think, write a book about it. But at the same time, it's a poem that works at so many different levels that I think it is very powerful, even at first reading. Just on an anecdotal level, I'm teaching actually a Donne seminar right now. And I have one student who recently we were reading actually the Holy Sonnets. I got an email from one particular student who asked me that we should definitely focus on Death Be Not Proud because they are taking the class in order to learn about Death Be Not Proud, the sonnet.
Okay.
So there is a student who is I wrote a book about the sonnet, but there is a student, what is more, there is a student who apparently is taking a class because of one poem.
Wow.
And was expecting to get there eventually. So let me read just these 14 lines. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate man, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and easier than thy stroke. Why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we live eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die.
Thank you. It's a beautiful poem. This poem, right, is based on a biblical passage from 1 Corinthians, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 15, right, which in the King James, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? And you elicit from this poem and its conversation with the concepts that it's engaging, this idea about holy attention. Is there a quick and easy, well, I'm going to ask you about some passages in a second in your book. Is there a quick and easy way for you to define what holy attention means? I know you wrote an entire book, it's 300 pages. Is there a capsule definition that you give to students or other engaged people, readers of your book, about what that is?
I'll attempt it. One of the reasons I would possibly want to rewrite this book if I could today is that the book really has 2 books in it, and maybe I was impatient and I should have written a first and then a second one about Donne specifically. And the first book would have been about holy attention as a historical concept.
Okay.
So one claim in this book is that there is a tradition within Christianity, but going even beyond Christianity, that for which a certain idea of attentiveness is quite central. And the idea here, that I can put it fairly succinctly, is that if one could attend without any distraction, absolutely perfectly, if you will, that could unite one with God. It's a very radical theological idea. It goes back to ascetic monastic traditions. And it is somewhat controversial within Western Christianity, at least. So one thing that the book does, it traces this idea. It is interested in how the idea remained operational, if you will, even in authors who did not necessarily embrace it explicitly theologically. So that's the sort of theological tradition. On the other hand, I was just interested in the question of attention itself, specifically in this sense, and this comes again out from out of the theological tradition, but I think goes way beyond to everyday life, everyday experience. The idea that every time you attend to anything, you do not attend to all the other things, if you will. So this is, St. Augustine talks a lot about this, especially in the Confessions, the idea that the difference between God and humans is that God can attend to everything at the same time without producing distraction, whereas we, every time we attend to anything, accumulate distraction. And in a sense, Augustine is interested in the temporal and spatial aspect. That is to say, when I attend to the now or when I attend to the here, then I do not attend to the then or the past, and I do not attend to the elsewhere. But in a sense, the same is true of intensity. It seems to me, the more I focus on something, the more I accumulate distraction, the more I'm unable to pay attention to anything else. Yeah. So the idea of a holy attention is attending in a way that does not accumulate distraction, that does not at the same time distract me from everything else. And that is an idea that I think is very prevalent in both thinking and practices of devotion. But actually, I think it's a very everyday experience as well, from, in such basic activities like playing basketball or trying to fall asleep. In all those, I at least regularly encounter the problem of how the more I focus, the more trouble I get myself into occasionally in terms of becoming rigid almost to everything else.
Yeah, in fact, there's a passage in your book that I really love that talks about there's a theological idea in there, but it also goes into everyday life. Exactly what you're describing. This is on page 12. I'll read this here. For Donne, being attentive in this life was a miracle comparable to the miracle he considered the most important element of the Christian faith, the resurrection. While in the resurrection, God miraculously collects the dissolved parts of the human body, in experiences of attention, it is the self whose scattered parts are miraculously reunited. Transient and unsustainable, experiences of attentiveness nevertheless have one advantage over the resurrection. They belong to this life. Right? That's a beautiful passage. Was that something that connection between attention and resurrection and the way that attention goes beyond resurrection in some ways into everyday experience, was that a piece, did you get that from your reading, or was that just your own insight into the nature of the poem about which you were writing?
I mean, this is a poem that is explicitly about the resurrection. The Corinthians passage that you quoted, or referred to, is a passage, and so much of the richness of Donne's sonnet comes from the fact that it is an engagement with the passage from the Corinthians. The Corinthians passage is Paul's attempt to first answer the question of what the resurrected body will look like or be like, but he doesn't quite manage to answer that. It includes some speculations about the spiritual body, but then Paul goes into this more rhetorical mode of announcing a kind of final victory over death, and at the same time he very much thinks about the epistemological question of what is the role of the idea of the resurrection in Christian faith in general. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that what Donne does in this poem is he continues thinking about those same questions, and especially about the epistemological question. That is to say, what does it mean to think the resurrection as a doctrine, if you will? What is the way in which prayer, meditation, other devotional practices can help you develop an attitude towards that idea, if you will? Donne was to me, one of the interesting things about Donne as an author is that he's not somebody who believes things without a problem, or it doesn't come easy to him. He's a very distracted author and very distracted thinker, who at the same time is absolutely committed to, for instance, the idea of the resurrection. And so negotiating those two things is what happens in this poem and in many other texts of Donne's.
It's fascinating. You have a great passage. This is one more passage from your book about thinking. I'm thinking about this, about the resurrection, what the implications are then for how we imagine life around us, not just a point at which one is or is not resurrected, but rather what that implies then for everyday existence. This is on page 27. It's still part of your introduction to the book. You write, in the conception of holy attention, a thought isn't just a mental proposition, but an event occurring to the attentive mind. And thinking isn't merely an attempt to formulate mental propositions, but a set of techniques whose goal is, paradoxically, to allow the unpredictable to happen. That's really beautifully formulated, David. Is that what you're talking about when what you were saying just a minute ago? Does that resonate, or is this getting onto a different track of your argument?
No, that's exactly what I was talking about. When Donne concludes this particular poem with the line, "And death shall be no more, death thou shalt die," this, of course, is beautifully written poetically, just in terms of the sound of this line. And when I teach this poem, I think it does have an impact on most of its readers. And then people, readers, myself, in the course of my first encounter with the poem, can get pretty disappointed when they read the Corinthians passage, because it turns out that, apologies to Donne, but this is pretty much Paul. He pretty much just quotes Paul in possibly the best line of the poem. Right. He simply sort of cites in his own, or at least paraphrases Paul. So in that sense, and this goes back to what I was saying about how the entire book really is, it comes out from the questions that I had about Donne's poem. And to some degree, an initial disappointment with Donne's poetry, and especially the Holy Sonnets, which always start out so powerfully. Donne is especially striking in his first lines. And then they conclude quite often with a line that is a close quotation or a paraphrasis of a doctrine, of a biblical quotation, a biblical line, like the Corinthians in this case. So that's why I started thinking about what is it that the poems may be doing in order to prepare for that line. Okay. Maybe what if we think about this not just as, oh, the poet just like sort of inserted that last line there because he had nothing better to say at that point, but rather that the work of the poem is to prepare the speaker, the reader, maybe the author, for the reception of that line, so to speak, to be able to think that line on their own.
That's very insightful. That's terrific. That makes a lot of sense. That really rings true. Which raises this question for me: how widely was the idea of holy attention thought in Donne's era, the early 17th century? Is Donne doing something unique here, or is he one of a group of poets who are all attending to more or less the same thing?
That's a really that's a really interesting question. And again, it makes me want to rewrite the book or write two versions of the book for the following reason. On the one hand, the theological idea of a holy attention, of an undistracted attentiveness, was, I argue in the book, very much present in the period. This had complex historical and theological reasons. It seems to me that the Reformation, but even, well, the Reformation especially, gave rise to a kind of return to ideas from asceticism, both critically but also receptively. So many prominent figures in the period were thinking anew about ideas of, for instance, perfect prayer. Mm-hmm. And perfect prayer is all, or at least I think very strongly related to this idea of a holy attention. And this included Catholic figures, Protestant figures, from Ignatius of Loyola himself, the author of the Spiritual Exercises, got in trouble for thinking about this tradition. And on the Protestant side, especially in the more radical circles, it too became a very powerful idea and ideal. But what I was interested in this book was actually, again, not so much the theological idea, but rather how the ideal of a holy attention remained operational in practice, even for people who would not embrace it explicitly at all. And what I want to emphasize here is Donne actually would not have agreed with many of the statements of my book. He was not somebody who would have theologically necessarily embraced some of the ideas associated with this tradition for a number of different reasons. I think partly because he was so invested in a kind of non-individualistic sense of what religion, what devotion should entail, and partly for reasons of character. As I mentioned, I think he's a very distracted author and character in general. So the issue for me wasn't whether Donne or any other poets in the period embraced this idea, but whether or not it influenced their poetry, whether or not it remained operational in their poetry. And in that sense, Donne is an extreme case, but I would argue that virtually every poet, especially poets who work in devotional poetry in the period, from Herbert to Vaughan, and beyond, obviously, the English context, you could give readings of their poetry in terms of how they operate with this idea of attentiveness.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you find that the idea persists in poetry into later periods? Or is it really the kind of thing that is, for a host of reasons, cultural and historical and religious, et cetera, political, is rooted in the 17th century with particular focus, or does it remain, for maybe some of the same reasons or some different reasons, active into later historical periods? Or is that question too big?
Well, it is probably, it would be too ambitious for me to give a yes or no answer, or really attempt an answer that includes all poets, or at least a lot of poets in the later period. But it seems to me that, first of all, there is a very strong tradition that comes out from the 17th century devotional poets who keep influencing poets. Obviously, in the 20th century, this gets particularly strong because of Eliot's embracing of the metaphysical poets. But Coleridge was a great reader of Donne. I think Coleridge is one of the best readers of Donne, actually, of all the sort of poetic readers of Donne. So first of all, there's direct influence, and I think insofar as there is direct influence, this idea of attentiveness for sure is influential as well. The second thing that I would say very quickly is that the association between this idea of attentiveness and religion may be particular to the metaphysical poets in the 17th century and the authors that they influence in later periods. But obviously, attentiveness as such. And I would make a claim about how the attentiveness in its everyday workings is related to the tradition that I'm talking about.
Okay, good. So here's an example. A couple of years ago, I was part of a symposium held at the University of Utah on the subject of attention, and the person that they used to give like the thematic overview is a quote from the 20th century mystic Simone Weil, right, who's written some very compelling things about attention. Here is a passage from one of her essays. I'm curious how you think this relates to Donne and how it differs from what Donne is doing. Here's what she says. Attention consists of suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. It means holding in our minds within reach of this thought, but on a lower level and not in contact with it, the diverse knowledge we've acquired, which we are forced to make use of. Our thought should be in relation to all particular and already formulated thoughts as a man on a mountain who, as he looks forward, sees also below him without actually looking at them a great many forests and plains. Above all, our thought should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that is to penetrate it. Thoughts on how that relates to Donne or how it differs in some essential way?
So this goes to the heart of what I was saying about Donne being an interesting author for me in the context of holy attention, precisely because he would never embrace that idea explicitly. So Donne would never write this passage, and in fact, he would be slightly scandalized by this passage, it seems to me. And yet, what the quotation from Weil is, it is a very explicit and direct expression of the ideal that I'm talking about. And in fact, Weil was, of course, familiar with certain trends in Christian mysticism, and I think it's very clear from this quotation that that's what inspires her thinking about attentiveness. So on the one hand, in terms of the theological tradition, I think the Weil quotation is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. On the other hand, what makes Donne, for me, an interesting author in this context is precisely the fact that he would theologically not embrace this, and that in the actual text, he struggles with it. Donne primarily is an author of distraction, I think. All of the poems get distracted, and it is only from the experience of distraction that some experience of attentiveness can arise. And this is why the poems are so interesting. Although this is not to say that this is not there in Weil as well. As far as I know, for instance, the headaches. I've always been fascinated with the headaches in Weil, and I wonder if the headaches had something to do with both the thirst for attentiveness and perhaps even as a kind of way of coping.
Yeah, she talks about, actually, she was a very an avid lover of George Herbert's poetry. And she would cite that to herself and recite it, and also take certain passages from the Bible, like the Lord's Prayer, and recite them as attention exercises to help alleviate some of the pain, at least distract her from it. Attention and distraction belong together, right? So distract from the one so as to attend to the other, or rather attend to the one so as to detract from the other. It's a fascinating story in her case about this. I'm curious about, so Donne. What in Donne's poem here strikes you? I say here, this is my copy of the poem that you read. What in Donne's poem seems to be especially lending itself to distraction? What inside of the poem is it trying to overcome to get us to a place where we can't attend properly?
The perhaps paradoxical answer to that is that it's precisely poetry and language very often that is both the source of distraction and at the same time a source of some experience of attentiveness. So in this particular holy sonnet, but this is actually, I think, true of a number of holy sonnets, and I tried to read a number of other holy sonnets as well. They begin very much in the mode of Donne's lyric poetry with a hyperbolical and, in a sense, audacious attack on death, and an address of death as a person. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. So it's both poetic and extremely simple in a sense, right? You're not any one of those things. You're not powerful. You shouldn't be proud, and you're not even terrifying. And then what the speaker does is it provides a set of arguments for why death shouldn't be any one of those things. And then concludes at the end of the poem, you see, death no longer even exists. And actually there is a turning away from a personified death, except in the last line, death sort of comes back, death, thou shalt die. So there is almost like a resurrection of death happening at the end. And what I'm trying to do in the book is to show how this is a consistent, if you will, technique in Donne, to get into a kind of enthused, lyrical, rhetorical, poetic exercise, only to realize that something has not been thought of. And that something, that thing from which you have gotten distracted, is what comes back at the end of the poem, here literally in the figure of a resurrected death, and becomes thereby the object of attention. And that's the sort of paradoxical triumph in the poem, because that does become, again, the target of attention at the end. But is that a defeat or a victory for
That's
the
great.
speaker?
Yeah, that's a
kind of
great
the
answer to
question.
my question. That's great, David. One thing you remark is that Donne's poems as attention exercises are, and I'm quoting here now from your book on page 33, they're aimed at allowing the speaker to think a religious doctrine with a certainty that is subjective and existential. In other words, they're meant to create a very specific kind of knowledge, namely faith. What does faith mean in this context of this poem?
This is actually not necessarily, I think, a new idea. The novelty that I'm trying to argue for is to connect this to the notion and the experience of attentiveness. The idea that there is an experience that is subjective, existential, if you will, and that has to do with faith, and that seems to be influential for Donne's Holy Sonnets, is pretty evident for those who work on Reformation theology and devotion. And actually, this is present even in Catholicism in the period and before. And the idea here, it's usually called application. The idea here is that there is a religious doctrine that you, as a community of believers, accept. That's a kind of faith. For instance, the idea of the resurrection, you accept it. But believing, for instance, the idea that Christ has redeemed mankind does not necessarily mean that you personally believe to be redeemed by Jesus Christ. And what happens in a lot of the Holy Sonnets is precisely the transition from, oh, I know that you have saved all of us, but have you saved me? Yeah. And of course, that's logically speaking, that doesn't make any sense. If Christ has saved everybody, then assumedly you're included in that everybody. But at an existential level, that's where the poems do a lot of the work of moving from the general to the particular, how to make faith, how to adjust it to the person, how to apply it to the person. And that's why in this poem, for instance, there is already a belief in death having been defeated at the beginning of the poem, but that's not enough. Something more needs to be fought for. Something more needs to be achieved by the end of the poem. There is one particular holy sonnet that is especially striking in this sense, because it ends with these two lines, just to shed some more light on this idea of application. It ends with, this is a holy sonnet that ends with a prayer. Here, on this lowly ground, teach me how to repent, for that's as good as if thou hadst sealed my pardon with thy blood. And what I have always found so striking about that line, especially the last line, teach me how to repent, says to God or Christ, because that's as good as if you had saved me. And of course, that's my students, some of whom are fairly familiar with the scriptures and with Christian theology, were just scandalized by this, because they were like, wait, is this poem saying that Christ has not saved mankind? And in a sense, it is saying, but of course, again, the transition here is from the general idea, Christ has saved everybody else, but have you saved me? And what can I do in order to get that general thing applied to me?
Right. This is what I was kind of saying at the very beginning of our discussion, right? That I'm really taken with insights like yours into how literature can make us think or feel in ways that might not otherwise be available to us, right? It can induce new ways of engaging the world, to convert sort of a faith as a proposition of an idea, right, that Christ has redeemed humankind, to an experience of conversion. These are very different kinds of things. And it suggests that there's a kind of that faith is not knowing of a standard kind. There's almost an aesthetic quality to faith, a felt quality to faith that allows it to count as a knowledge of a different quality than knowledge of everyday sort of material reality, which I find provocative. Is there a virtue, you think, to that kind of understanding? Whether it be about faith or something else, do you find yourself as a teacher or as a writer, as a thinker, thinking widely and regularly about the things that literature can do in this way to generate effects? Is that what draws you to this kind of, I guess, were you more drawn to the fact that this poem generates certain effects as a literary phenomenon, or were you more taken with how it engages a specific tradition in a new or different way? If that question makes sense, what draws it? Is it more the aesthetic quality of what it's doing, or is it more the responsiveness in the tradition to what already pre-existed it?
That's a big question. So
impossibly big, perhaps.
A little bit impossibly big. Let me try to think about it. I will just think about it as I speak. So one thing that I found and still find, actually, even more than before, so striking in Donne's poetry is how words in this poetry very often become things. What I mean by that is, for instance, Donne has a very strange way of using deictic words. It, they, them, here, then. He loves those words. And he loves to use those words in a way that makes you very uncertain about what is it exactly that they do? What is it that they refer to? So you can't very often read these poems quickly because they have these words thrown in. And you just have to stop and sort of start searching in the syntax for what they could possibly refer to. And one way of thinking about this is that you have found out what the poem means when you have figured out what a deictic word refers to within the previous lines. Another way of thinking about it is that deictic words allow Donne to do this turning of words that we usually take to mean things into things that are almost like balls in a room that are just moving in all kinds of different directions and give you this dizzying experience. And in that sense, I find it really fascinating how literary texts, particularly poetry, but literary texts in general, are able to take one of the most everyday experience that we have, which is the use of language, and transform it. Some people call this defamiliarization, but my interest, what I'm trying to say, is not so much that it's a different meaning or that it creates a distance from the everyday way of using words as meaningful, but specifically the way in which in poetry things are turned into things and therefore become part of a sensual experience. And so to try to go back to your question about faith, to try to do faith, if you will, in poetry is a particularly exciting exercise. And I think this, I do believe that both Donne and his readers were very clear on that this is what was happening in the Holy Sonnets. Because he shared these poems with friends and potential patrons all the time. And I think that was both to show off his poetic skills, as he very often did, but also to share this experience and the techniques of achieving this experience of thinking about things that can be very abstract and making them sort of sensually available to himself and readers.
Nice. You really bring that out beautifully over the length of the book here, Death Be Not Proud. It's a beautiful book. I'm wondering, when you find yourself in front of a classroom of undergraduates, in a poetry seminar. Is that what you try to communicate about why poetry is valuable or matters? Or is it a different kind of case you make? Or do you assume that if they are there, they must already love it? I mean, do you find you need to make the case? If you do, what case do you make?
Oh, wow. A couple things. Since I am teaching Donne right now, I have a lot to say about this, but let me just try to focus on two. One is, as you said, I don't have to sell Donne's poetry in most of the cases. My experience has been that the best way of selling Donne's poetry is just read a poem, um, and most students, most people who encounter Donne's poetry, I think got hooked pretty quickly. At the very least, intrigued by this poetry. So I don't really have to make a strong pitch there. The question of once you're in the process of reading, once you're, for instance, in the middle of a difficult semester like the semester right now, how do you defend, and especially an entire course in Donne? One really great experience that I recently had with my students was that I think people are moved by Donne's poetry. This is poetry that very often is so tender, that and just moving, that it really has that kind of impact on people. But I think very often Donne's poetry is read by sort of modern post-romantic standards. And so one thing that I have been doing in my class right now is I repeatedly showed how poems that they felt that they found personally moving were actually written to gain patronage or for whatever purposes that I think in the 21st century we do not associate with those moving things. And at a certain point, one student of mine said, I have developed trust issues with Donne. And to me, that was actually a somewhat rewarding experience because I felt like, okay, it took a couple of weeks, but finally we are at a point where we can start talking about what makes this poetry actually interesting, in what ways it is actually a genuine challenge, I think, to the modern reader to understand that Donne can be simultaneously completely serious about religion, about love, and at the same time, write an outrageously long poem about the death of a young woman. I'm talking, of course, about the famous first anniversary, The Anatomy of the World. Write a poem to commemorate a young woman on the occasion of the death of a young woman he'd never met. Like, this idea for my students was just absolutely scandalizing. And it was a really interesting exercise to try to see how you could read the poem and take it at both of those levels or at all of those levels.
That really captures, I think, the art of the English professor. If you can present something that is moving and illustrate it in a way that really elicits these feelings in readers and students, on the one hand, and then show that the thing may be operating at a wholly different level than one may at first imagine. There's an art to that, and that art is captured here so well. We have like about a minute left is all, David. Your current work, this is 4 years old on this book. Is your current work along the same direction, or is it wholly different material?
It's fairly different, but it has a connection to the book. I'm not actually speaking of English, speaking of the art of teaching literature. I don't have a background in English literature. I was trained originally as in a philosophy department, then in the comparative literature department. I got interested in certain concepts, then in Donne's poetry, and that landed me, thankfully, in an English department. And I've been obviously very happy to be where I am at UC-Berkeley. But at the same time, it's a foreign environment to me. And I did not know when I wrote this book how important Donne was for English as a discipline, English as a tradition. So what I have been working on in recent months and years, even is a kind of understanding of the English department. I'm really fascinated with not so much the discipline. It seems to me that a lot of the current conversations focus on discipline. I have doubts about whether or not English is a discipline in the first place. But I'm very interested in the department as an institutional structure in its relationship to both the university and to the public world, if you will. What is the function of the English department historically and today? That's what I'm working on. The connection a little bit is between Donne and English, but the current work does not focus on Donne or even on poetry.
That's great. Years ago, a colleague of mine, who's actually been a guest on the podcast, Karen Craig, pointed out that it was Herbert Grierson's edition of Donne at the University of Aberdeen in the early 20th century. Ends up being a very important way to articulate the importance of Donne to further English study. It became important to T.S. Eliot. Anyway, I'm making some threads here, connections that are things I've known about. And he drew out actually how Robert Burns had drawn upon Donne's work, and Burns was so important to Scottish literature into the 20th century and beyond. Anyway, this has been a fascinating conversation, David. Your work is just terrific, and thank you for taking time to talk to us. This book is great, and when your next book comes out, we'll get you back on to talk about that.
I really look forward to that, especially to completing that first book, that second book, and but also to the opportunity of being back here. And thank you so much. That was really, really rich conversation.
Thank you, David. Take care. Thank you for listening to this episode of the BYU Humanities Center podcast. Think clearly, act well, appreciate life. This podcast is sponsored by the Humanities Center and the College of Humanities of Brigham Young University and is produced and edited by Brooke, Browne and Sam Jacob. The music for this podcast is composed by Ethan Wickman and is performed by the Soli Chamber Orchestra and Nicholas Phillips on Albany Records. I'm Matthew Wickman, founding director of the BYU Humanities Center and host of this podcast. If you're interested in other episodes of this podcast or want to know more about the BYU Humanities Center, check out our website at humanitiescenter.byu.edu. Thanks again for listening.